Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmospheres, Fisheries, and the Coast Guard will now come to order. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank our witnesses for appearing. We have two panels today and very distinguished witnesses. I also just want to mention at the outset, this is one of these issues that I think a lot of times take place in Washington, but you don't get a lot of media attention because they're very bipartisan. And sometimes I think our media, whether here or back home, loves to focus on the conflict. But on a big issue, very important to the country, that's bipartisan, you get a little less attention, maybe because there's not so much conflict here. But nevertheless, I want to thank my colleagues here for being here. I particularly want to thank Senator Booker for his leadership on this issue. Hopefully Senator Whitehouse is going to be joining us soon. But as all of you know, marine debris poses a significant threat to our natural areas, wildlife, shorelines across the United States, our fisheries, but also across the globe. 8 million metric tons of marine debris enters our oceans and Great Lakes every year. My state of Alaska in particular is impacted. We have 34,000 miles of coastline, larger than any other state. As a matter of fact, larger than the rest of the coastline of the United States combined. And we are very negatively impacted by marine debris as ocean currents carry millions of tons of trash to our shores in Alaska. But it's not just marine debris impacting the livelihood of the people of my state. It's literally every state with a shoreline, whether New Jersey or Hawaii or Michigan in our country. What is particularly troubling about the marine debris challenge and crisis, and we believe it's absolutely a crisis, is that the majority of marine debris in the world's oceans come from 5 countries in Asia: China, Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and South Korea. So a few months ago, a bipartisan group of my Senate colleagues and I introduced the Save Our Seas Act, which takes steps to engage these countries, which is why it's so important to have the State Department represented here, and also provide our federal agencies with the resources they need to clean up our waters and prevent trash from becoming marine debris. It's encouraging that senators from both sides of the aisle are working together to introduce meaningful legislation to tackle the important issue of marine debris, and our bill has already been unanimously moved out of the Commerce Committee, and I believe we're starting to look at the possibility of hotlining it. The Save Our Seas Act encourages the administration and State Department to engage with the world's leading trash producers and to take steps to address the impact of marine debris so that we can together become better stewards of our environment, oceans, and waterways. Not only should we be helping other countries bolster their waste management infrastructure, but we should also try to help facilitate a cultural change. As children in this country, we learn about recycling and are taught about respect for our environment and natural places, but this is not the case everywhere in the world, and I look forward to hearing from Ambassador Bolton how we can help export this stewardship mentality to other nations. The Save Our Seas Act also reauthorizes NOAA's important marine debris program, which is led by Ms. Wallace, our other witness today. It has helped clean debris on America's shorelines in the Great Lakes since 2006. The Save Our Seas Act would also provide additional support to states in the event of severe marine debris events like the one we saw following the Fukushima tsunami. Last Congress, I had the opportunity to hold a hearing on this topic as chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee's Subcommittee on Fisheries, Water, and Wildlife. And again, I want to thank Senator Whitehouse for his leadership on that committee. Last year, he and I were the chair and ranking member on that hearing. And I look forward today to building on that, to hear the perspective of federal agencies and others most engaged on this topic, to learn about their efforts to combat marine debris and suggestions on how we in the Congress can do a better job. Our oceans are a bipartisan issue. Please accept the introduction and unanimous support of this committee of the Save Our Seas Act as a demonstration of that bipartisan support. I want to thank our witnesses, Senator Peters and others for the hard work on this important legislation. We are looking forward to a meaningful committee hearing today. Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Chairman Sullivan, for calling this hearing, and I want to also join in thanking our witnesses, Ambassador Bolton, Director Wallace, and I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Melissa Duhain from the University of Michigan, who will be sharing her research and expertise on debris in the Great Lakes. Mr. Chairman, clearly your state, with the longest shoreline in the United States, is vulnerable to the negative consequences of marine debris. But my home state of Michigan certainly is not immune from it, with more freshwater coastline than any other state, and second only to Alaska in total shoreline. And though we may call it marine debris, what we're really talking about is trash pollution in our water. Water that is in the Great Lakes, providing drinking water, navigation, abundant opportunities for recreation, including fishing, boating, and diving. Folks used to think that dilution is the solution to pollution, but in the Great Lakes, the negative consequences of that strategy are readily apparent. In 2015 alone, the Alliance for the Great Lakes removed nearly 100,000 pounds of debris from Great Lakes coastal habitats. And that may not have even, and that didn't even put a dent in it, because scientists estimate that there are nearly 22 million pounds of plastic pollution that enters into the Great Lakes every single year. In Lake Michigan alone, that translates to approximately 100 Olympic-sized pools full of plastic bottles every year going into it. And while surface currents move ocean debris into floating garbage patches, winds and lake currents often bring Great Lakes trash right onto our beautiful beaches. So it's no surprise that in 1970, it was a Great Lakes Senator, Gaylord Nelson, who spearheaded the very first Earth Day. Around that time, the 3 R's emerged, and school children were learning to recycle, reduce, and reuse. And to this day, the 3 R's provide a roadmap to address our growing trash problem, both in the Great Lakes as well as in the oceans. And yes, cleanup is certainly essential, but we have to stem the tide of trash before it actually enters into the waterways. In Michigan, NOAA is playing a very key role. The Northeast Michigan Great Lakes Stewardship Initiative, Michigan Sea Grant, Michigan State University Extension Office, and the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary have come together in a partnership with schools, teachers, and most importantly, with leaders of tomorrow to raise awareness about Great Lakes trash pollution. Last year, a team of Alpena, Michigan public school students at Ella M. White Elementary School used nets to trawl for garbage in the Thunder Bay River, and they were shocked with what they found. And so they created a film called Plastics 101. And the video adds a fourth R to the old adage, and that is refuse, meaning to refuse single-use plastics whenever you can. So I think it's safe to say that their families are probably now using reusable grocery bags and water bottles after the production of that film. And this creative and informative film will be shown to 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders learning about single-use plastic pollution. Trash pollution is also a global problem in need of global solutions. The U.S. is a party to both international treaties governing the at-sea waste disposal, the London Convention, and MARPOL Annex 5. But as I believe you'll hear today, most marine debris, about 80%, actually starts on land. It isn't intentionally released into our water, but it ends up there because of waste management, can certainly be a challenge, or due to natural processes like wind, storms, or floods. The Department of State is integral to efforts to improve waste management systems in developing nations. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm heartened by your leadership on the Save Our Seas Act and your eagerness to work together to strengthen the marine debris program at NOAA and the Department of State. I'm concerned that if we don't adequately fund these initiatives, we will pay for it in the long run. Trash pollution impedes waterborne commerce. It can introduce invasive species that wreak havoc on local ecosystems as well as our economies. And trash pollution introduces chemicals into our food chain. But this problem is one that we can begin to address. And I'm confident that our up-and-coming leaders, folks like the Ella White Elementary River Raiders and Bob Thompson's class, will use technology, innovation, and awareness much better than we may have done in the past. But one thing is for sure, they are certainly watching our example here today, and we look forward to making a move forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Peters, and I appreciate the witnesses that we have for this hearing today. Ambassador David Bolton, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans, Fisheries in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environment and Scientific Affairs, and Nancy Wallace, the Director of NOAA's Marine Debris Program. You will have 5 minutes to deliver your oral statement. A longer written statement will be included in the record if you so choose. Why don't we begin with Ambassador Bolton?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Peters, members of the subcommittee. I really do appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I do have a written statement and ask that it be included in the record.
Without objection.
As you said, Senator, marine debris is a large and growing global problem. It harms fishing industries through losses due to abandoned and derelict fishing gear. Floating debris fouls ship drives and poses major navigational hazards to ocean-going vessels. It imposes costs on the tourism industry, and of course it harms the marine environment itself. Though marine debris includes various materials, one of the most common and troublesome is plastic. Current estimates indicate that there are already 150 million tons of plastic waste in the ocean, and as you said, another 8 million tons added each year. Without action, there could be 1 ton of plastic for every 3 tons of fish in the ocean by 2025, and by 2050 there could be more plastic than fish by weight in the ocean. No nation acting alone can solve this problem. Objects then to the ocean in one location wash up thousands of miles away, making marine debris truly a transnational issue. Similarly, governments acting alone cannot solve the problem. Combating marine pollution effectively requires efforts from all stakeholders, public and private. But the very visible nature of marine debris and the rapidly growing awareness of its costs has made it an issue of strong public interest. I'm happy to report that a large and growing number of international organizations and fora are now focusing on marine debris, and a growing number of stakeholders are working with governments to address the problem. My department, the Department of State, works with NOAA and other interested agencies, foreign governments, international organizations, private sector, civil society, to raise awareness of the problem and to push for remedial action. Let me just mention a few examples. The Our Ocean conferences made marine pollution a real focus, producing significant public and private action. The 2016 conference alone yielded commitments of about $1 billion to address marine pollution and spurred partnerships of various kinds. The next Our Ocean conference, which will take place this October in Malta, will again have marine pollution as a focal point. The United Nations has also given marine debris increasing attention, partly because of our advocacy and extensive work. The UN launched its Global Partnership on Marine Litter in 2012. 2 weeks ago, a UN Ocean Conference in New York focused on sustainable implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 14, which commits all governments to reduce and prevent marine debris of all kinds. In the G7, we are working to coordinate individual country initiatives, for example, by supporting additional research on microplastics and their impact on human health, improve scientific monitoring, and advocating for better use of resources to recover, reduce, recycle, and repurpose waste. Through the G20, we seek to connect with key developing partners, such as India, Brazil, and South Africa, with U.S. agencies to share our expertise and to promote their capacity to become regional leaders. As Senator Peters mentioned, we are party to the Marine Pollution Suite of Conventions adopted by the IMO, particularly Annex 5. We're also party to a protocol to the Cartagena Convention on land-based sources of marine pollution. Using this tool, we are leading an effort to make marine debris reduction a priority in the Caribbean region. In the South Pacific, we're using the Noumea Convention to provide financial and technical supports to governments in that region. Our current focus is on East Asia for the reason you stated, Mr. Chairman. Rapidly developing Asian economies are responsible for more than half of all plastic waste entering the ocean. It's clear that the growth of these economies has outpaced their capacity to manage waste. Improving waste management infrastructure in these nations can dramatically reduce the amount of plastic entering the ocean. And so, through APEC, partnering with the Japanese government, American industry, and conservation groups, we brought together government officials, development banks, experts, and NGOs to spur financing for solid waste management systems in the Asia-Pacific region. We also seek to work bilaterally. We are supporting Indonesia, for example, that has announced the goal to reduce its marine litter by 70% by 2025. Among other things, we sponsored Dr. Jembak of the University of Georgia, one of the foremost experts in the field, to travel to Indonesia and to the Philippines and Japan and South Africa to catalyze action. We facilitated a sister city program between 2 American and 2 Chinese cities to share best practices on waste management. These are some of the examples of the State Department's engagement. Thank you once again for the opportunity to testify. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. Ms. Wallace.
Good morning, Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Members Peters, and members of the subcommittee. As you mentioned, I'm Nancy Wallace, and I'm the Director of the Marine Debris Program at NOAA within the Department of Commerce. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the issue of marine debris, and my full written testimony is submitted for the record.
Without objection.
One of our biggest impacts to our oceans comes in the form of marine debris. Once treated as an infinite resource, the ocean is now overflowing with man-made items that do not belong there. These items invariably include things like beverage containers, cigarette butts, single-use plastic bags, and other consumer products. Marine debris ranges in size from derelict fishing gear and abandoned and derelict vessels to small plastic fragments and spheres that are less than 5 millimeters in size. Negative impacts of marine debris on the environment include ghost fishing of marine species by derelict gear, entanglement of marine mammals, sea turtles, and other species, habitat destruction, and ingestion of debris of all kinds. Additionally, marine debris can create navigational hazards, cause significant economic loss, and affect human health and safety. The NOAA Marine Debris Program leads efforts in the United States to research, prevent, and reduce the impacts of marine debris. Authorized by the Marine Debris Act and amendments, the program supports marine debris projects in partnership with state and local agencies, tribes, non-governmental organizations, academia, and industry. Our mission is to investigate and prevent adverse impacts of marine debris. To accomplish this mission, our program is built upon 5 main program pillars: research, removal, prevention, regional coordination, and emergency response. Research is critical to our understanding of the sources of marine debris and the adverse impacts that it has on the marine environment and humans. NOAA has funded research projects that focus on filling key gaps in our understanding of marine debris, such as evaluating the effects of microplastics on marine species and assessing economic and environmental impacts of consumer debris and derelict fishing gear. NOAA annually funds marine debris removal projects across the United States, including in logistically challenging locations such as Alaska and the Pacific Islands. For example, we are partnering with the Sitka Sound Science Center on removal efforts in remote marine debris hotspots communities in the Bering Sea, such as St. Lawrence Island and the Pribilof Islands. While removal can have immediate impacts on the marine environment, prevention is the ultimate key to reducing and eliminating marine debris. We like to use the analogy of turning off the tap. Improving waste management and infrastructure and facilitating behavior changes are some of the most effective ways to stop marine debris from entering the environment in the first place. Currently, NOAA partners are working with communities around the country to create networks of local leaders for prevention efforts and educate the public on what actions they can take to help address marine debris. Such successful coordination and collaboration with our partners would not be possible without our regional staff that are located in 10 regions around the country. These regional coordinators are the boots on the ground for the program, leading efforts to develop state and regional marine debris action plans that outline the major goals for preventing and reducing marine debris based on local needs and issues. As part of our final program pillar, emergency response, NOAA responds to events such as hurricanes, tsunamis, and flooding by leading detection, modeling, monitoring, and removal efforts in affected areas. The program is also proactively working with federal, state, and local partners to develop marine debris emergency response guides for all coastal states. Marine debris is a global problem that has local solutions. Every country faces unique challenges, and one size does not fit all. The most successful solutions take into account local knowledge and challenges, as well as the best practices and lessons learned from across the global community. NOAA works very closely with the Department of State and participates in international efforts, including the United Nations Environment Global Partnership on Marine Litter, the G7 and G20 efforts, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify about this very, very important issue. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, and thank you, Ms. Wallace. Let me begin with some questions for both of you. Ambassador Bolton, it was noted in your testimony about the challenges that we have with regard to the contributions of ocean debris and trash from countries in Asia, particularly the 5 that I noted in my testimony. Why are these countries such great contributors to trash in our oceans? I mean, what is driving this?
I think the simple answer to that, Senator, is that their pace of economic development is just moving ahead so much more rapidly than their waste management capabilities. So to get a handle on this, we really need to help them improve waste management processes.
So it's the issue, is it also a cultural issue, though, as well, in terms of, and I'm not talking about a culture in Asia, I'm talking about a culture of recycling, litter. Are there more things? Is that, it's economic growth, but is it also kind of the recognition that this isn't a problem?
I think we certainly have a greater level of recognition here in the United States, perhaps in Europe and other developed countries. But take Indonesia for an example. They have announced a goal to reduce by 70% their marine pollution by 2025. That strikes me as reflective of a culture that cares about this issue and wants to take action. I think we can use that, Indonesia's example, and hold that up to some of the other Asian states as the type of steps that they should be taking.
Let me follow up on that. In the Save Our Seas Act, one of the important elements of it is that it encourages the administration and the Department of State to become more engaged with the world's leading marine debris producers. Your testimony, I think, did a really good job of laying out what is happening, and it's not inconsequential. There's obviously a lot of effort on this, whether it's individual countries like Indonesia or the UN or the G20 or G7. You mentioned it's come up in a lot of different fora. But what specific opportunities do you see for U.S. leadership in this area, as we have encouraged in our bipartisan bill, and to focus on results?
Given that a big part of the problem is in Asia, probably the best forum is APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. It has already proven itself willing as a forum to provide a venue for dealing with these issues. The other economies seem willing to use APEC for this purpose. So we have ways of channeling technical and financial resources to countries in questions through APEC. We have programs we can push forward through APEC. I would point to that as one particularly promising place for U.S. leadership. ASEAN might also be used in parallel. We have not used ASEAN so much as we might, so I could consider going there. We have some higher level opportunities. The Our Ocean Conference series that we inaugurated here in the United States is moving forward. I mentioned earlier the next conference will be in Malta. They want, and the EU will host it, they want to focus on marine pollution again as a main topic. We can press for commitments there. In the Caribbean, the South Pacific, we have regional seas programs we're members of. We can use them. And here's one thought that we have not done enough about. The regional fishery management organizations that exist in the world could do more to deal with the problem of lost, abandoned, derelict fishing gear. I think we should be using them.
Well, look, we want to work with you on all of these opportunities. When we introduced this bill, I've had a number of leaders from different countries express interest in cooperating with the United States. I think there's a lot of encouragement. But I also think there's a recognition that globally this is not going to really happen in terms of solid results unless the U.S. is one of the key leaders, and that's part of what we're trying to do in the bill. Ms. Wallace, let me ask a couple questions in my remaining time here. First, thank you for the work that you're doing in Alaska and the rest of the country. Two quick questions. You talk about your association with other groups, local groups. What can Congress do to better assist you with your efforts at NOAA? And then more specifically, you talk about research, and particularly microplastics and how they impact fish. As you know, in Alaska right now, we have salmon runs happening throughout our wonderful state. The biggest salmon runs on the planet Earth are taking place right now. What happens with regard to microplastics in fish like salmon? Has the research indicated any kind of negative impact that you've been able to see?
Great, thank you for those questions. I think to answer your first question in terms of support that Congress can give, I think what I want to say most is thank you for the support you're already giving. Having a hearing like this, bringing the attention to the issue is incredibly helpful. I think working with the local partners that we work with in your states has been incredibly valuable. They're doing amazing work, and Congress has a substantial reach. So if constituents call and say, what can we do to help this problem? The answer is, join a cleanup, think about what you're using, recycle, don't litter. There's some real simple actions that can have a big impact. To the second question on microplastics, we are doing a lot of research on microplastics. We're looking at what the impacts of microplastics are on commercial fish species as well as invertebrates. So for example, in oysters, we know that when oysters ingest microplastics, it can affect their ability to reproduce. So there is an impact, and we need to continue to do research. In Alaska, we've been working with the Auk Bay Lab to really look at what juvenile salmon are eating. Do they eat small pieces of polystyrene, or do they try to avoid it? If they do eat it, what happens to them? I think those studies are still ongoing, and we have more to learn, but there certainly is concern. These are commercially caught species that we want to learn more about, what those potential impacts are up the trophic chain.
Great, thank you. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to our witnesses here today. I appreciate your testimony. Ambassador Bolton, you have discussed, both in your opening comments as well as questions from Chairman Sullivan, the work the Department of State is doing around the world in collaboration with other countries and coordinating with other countries. But given the issues that we have in the Great Lakes, which I outlined in my opening statement, the country that has an impact with that is Canada.
Yes.
So I would be interested in what ways is the U.S. collaborating with Canada on debris in the Great Lakes and in the region, and can we be doing a better job? What are your suggestions?
We do cooperate with Canada. They are quite like-minded with us. They see marine debris pollution in the Great Lakes included as a significant problem. We have a couple of bilateral mechanisms we can use, including something set up by the International Boundary Waters Treaty 100 years ago. It's a good forum for that. We also have the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission that can deal with problems of lost, abandoned, derelict fishing gear. So those are some of the avenues I see for moving forward with Canada. I think we're pushing on an open door with them. They want to do more with us.
Well, that's good to hear. Pastor Weldon, the administration has proposed cutting roughly about 30% from the State Department budget, and I'm sure that a cut of that magnitude will have significant impact on a lot of what the State Department does. But could you address what that kind of cut could possibly mean to our international efforts to deal with the marine debris problem?
Senator, I guess I'd answer your question this way. I've been at the department coming up on 32 years. I've seen our budgets rise and fall. The role of the State Department that I've outlined here is one of advocacy, convening, sending experts around the world. It doesn't cost a great deal of money. These are not high-dollar programs. And I am reasonably confident that whatever our budget is in FY18 and beyond, we will be able to continue to do this type of work on an issue as important as this.
Director Wallace, conversations on marine debris seem to always lead to more questions than answers. This is a very complicated subject, and we're starting to delve into that with this hearing, as well as the other work that we're doing. But one of the top-tier issues that was identified in the Great Lakes Marine Debris Action Plan was the need to just further refine the scope of the problem and better define what is really currently known about some of these issues. What, in your estimate, what are some of the biggest gaps in our knowledge when it comes to the marine debris issue?
Well, I think the Great Lakes Action Plan was a real model for that conversation. And just to share that we did have great participation from Canada in the Great Lakes Action Plan as well. One of the emerging issues I think we're hearing more and more about that we'd like to do more research and understanding on is the microfiber issue. Microplastics is getting a lot of attention, and there's been great work at reducing the sources around potentially microbeads. But what we're learning now is microfibers that can come off our clothes are actually a huge issue as well. So I think in terms of research, looking at how we may be able to prevent that source of debris, also looking at what the potential impacts are around that source of debris are important.
So we, as you know, last Congress passed the Microbead-Free Waters Act, which dealt with microbeads. Do you think something along that lines may be necessary for microfibers, or is it still too early to know that? What should be our path forward?
Well, I think you made a great point before about always raising more questions. And so I think with the microfiber, we'd have to look at how you would do that. So I think that's where the discussions would come in. You know, is there some sort of technology that can help to eliminate the fibers going through wastewater treatment plants? With the microbeads, we know exactly where they are. They are in our cosmetic products. So having passed that legislation really helped prevent a specific source of debris. So I think it would be great for all types of debris to start looking at how we prevent those specific types of debris.
Great. Well, thank you. And finally, could you talk a little bit about how NOAA measures progress in addressing marine debris on a regional basis? So specifically the Great Lakes, as you're looking at what is truly a global problem, but a significant one, the Great Lakes regionally. How are NOAA's efforts used to review that?
Well, I think the Great Lakes Action Plan, as I said, is a model. And what we like to do is, because there are such different types of debris issues in different places, we can really focus on measuring success. So in the Great Lakes specifically, looking at how much debris we've removed. So we've partnered with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, for example, in Belle Isle to remove lots and lots of debris. We can also have monitoring programs that look at statistically robust, getting people out on the shorelines to count how much debris is out there. Over time, we hope to be able to reduce it. And we also measure success by how many people we're reaching. So getting that prevention message out. In 2017 alone, we've reached over 16,000 K through 12 students, which is a great number. And we'll continue to do that because I think behavior change is a big way we are going to make success happen.
Right. Thank you, and thank you for your efforts. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I never realized there was was an issue or there's a problem until Senator Sullivan was elected and made it very clear to me of the problem that exists up in his area and the source of that problem. But that got me interested in another area because back in the real world, I was a builder and developer in South Texas, back when I enjoyed life. And I remember so well during that time. In fact, do you remember the Ridley sea turtle? It started by Isla Letcher. She died at 100. And she and I used to work together as long as 60 years ago on some problems and with that particular. Very few places where they breed, and that happened to be one of the places. Yeah. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that this has become, something's been a problem down there, but nobody talks about it down in South Texas. Now, I noticed that most of you talk about in the Asians and where the problem is, and you mentioned, Ms. Wallace, in your testimony that they picked up Cartagena Convention. Now, when was that?
Excuse me?
The Cartagena Convention.
I'll turn that over.
I thought you said you were the one who referenced that.
I may have mentioned that, Senator.
Okay.
The original Cartagena Convention, I believe, dates about 30 years ago, but there was a protocol to it on land-based sources of marine pollution that is more recent, I want to say in the 90s, and we became party to it probably in the late 90s. Anyway, it's a tool for working with other countries in the Caribbean region on this.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, I appreciate very much your answer to the question that was asked you, because quite often, you know, I know there are dedicated people that you work with, and you've been there for a long time, who are going to see to it that these programs are carried on, in spite of having to tighten up a little bit in fiscal things. Now, the reason I mentioned the Cartagena Convention, because that focused on the projects. I think you had a project in Jamaica and in Panama,
yes,
getting closer to the area where I worked for some 15 years. Now, this I can't believe I would assume that the same problems exist in some of the Mexican areas and Central American areas as do in Asia. And the reason I bring this up is because in that case, they say that there's an ingestion of something that is affecting in a negative way the Ridley sea turtles. In fact, just as recently as 2 months ago, I was down there talking about that. Can you, either one of you, are you familiar with in that area? I know that that's not the area of concentration in this committee, but how they might be affected?
I can take that one. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. We need to work more with our partners to the south. Specifically in South Texas, we have monitoring programs around South Padre Island that just show a massive amount of debris washing ashore, especially the way the currents bring the water and the trash up from Mexico, and certain debris items you can certainly track back. And so that's something that we are working on very strongly. We have some grants with groups in South Texas to do a lot of removal and prevention, specifically around the sea turtles and prevention around sea turtles, how to make sure we're not impacting them, because sea turtles can certainly ingest things like plastic bags or other debris items that can be of a big problem. We also have some really strong partnerships in Southern California and San Diego area, where just over from Tijuana, there's trash coming into the Tijuana River. And so we've provided funding to set up booms that will actually catch that trash before it goes out into the open ocean. But we're also working on prevention efforts in Tijuana as well.
Okay, well, I'm very interested in that area down there. You know, I can remember back when the big issue was turtle exclusions from shrimp boats, and we had very positive results of getting involved in that.
Yes.
So there can be some things that we help us. So what I would ask of either of you to kind of help me be informed, because I work with those people still on a regular basis. And there are a lot of people down there concerned about that, and I think they need a little guidance, because until this hearing came along, I was not aware of that. So if you keep me informed in that particular area, it'd be very helpful.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Inhofe. Those questions. Senator Booker.
So I'm really grateful. This is an important hearing. It's an issue I've been pushing and pounding away on since I introduced the bill in at last Congress. In absentia, I just want to say how grateful I am to Senator Sullivan for picking this up, being a champion, making more people aware of it. Generous comments by Senator Inhofe about Senator Sullivan's leadership in making people aware. And I'm psyched about the bipartisan efforts that are going on right now. But the problem is every time I sit down to read about this problem, I realize that it is far more dire than we are expressing. And that the reality is, despite all these really good efforts, we are barreling towards a crisis of global proportions. So the amount of plastics being poured into our oceans, the amount of plastics, period, has increased 20-fold in the last 50 years. And that curve of increase in plastics production is not being bent. And with the onslaught of shipping stuff around the world, the expanding globalization, this production of plastics is just growing and growing and growing. And it's nice also that we're talking to other areas on the planet Earth about their problems. But in the United States, we recycle only 8% of this plastic. The rest of it goes into two channels. One into our landfills, which we may think is okay, but we'll talk about the carbon problem in a second. The other, a third of it, ends up in our oceans. and our waterways. And so, again, I'm excited about the progress we're making, but I really do feel like we are on our hands and knees crawling in the foothills, and there is an Everest of a problem that is screaming towards us that we don't seem to understand. It is terrifying when I sit down and read the problem. And frankly, there's enough reasons already that our grandchildren should be ticked off about this generation, what they stuck them with. But what our grandchildren are going to inherit is unconscionable. You know, right now, we have about a third of all plastics, as I said, escape the ecosystem, escape collection systems, rather, and wind up floating in the sea or in the stomachs of our animals and birds. And that amounts to 8 metric tons a year, right now, before the increase. Now, that's about 5 bags filled of plastic for every foot of coastline in the world. Because we throw out these numbers and people don't seem to grasp how much plastic is out there right now. For every foot of coastline on the planet Earth, you can have 5 plastic bags full of this stuff. We now, as plastic production accounts for so much of our oil consumption, but that's going to increase. Right now it's 6%, soon it'll be 15% of our oil production is going into producing plastics. And the crazy thing is the carbon emissions alone by 2050 will be accounting for 15% of the carbon emission budget that we have before we go to points of no return. And so what I'm so encouraged by the partnership, by bipartisan partnership on this, but it is just not enough. And so Director Wallace, please could you help just honestly put aside your the encouraging efforts that are going on that are really good to see. But could you let me know your personal sense of alarm at the nature and gravity of the global crisis we have, that by 2050, we will be in a state of planetary peril? Would you please tell me if am I exaggerating that in your personal opinion?
This is an alarming issue. It is, and I think we do need to pay attention to it. And I am happy that we're here talking about this. It's something I work on every single day, so I do have to have a sense of optimism. Otherwise, it would be a hard job to have. And I think you're exactly right. One of the things that we keep talking about is, you know, the biggest polluters on that study that we're mentioning, the Jambeck study, are in Asia, the 5 biggest countries. But the United States is number 20, and we are the #1 generator of waste in the world. So we are contributing to this problem. And I think what we need to do is to raise some alarm bells to say this is a big issue. It is something we can change. There are actions that we can take. We can absolutely use less, generate less waste.
Well, Ms. Wallace, so can I just, because my time has expired, but I just need to say this.
Yes.
I've learned the hard way from inner city Newark, New Jersey, that hope does not exist in the abstract.
Right.
It is a response to despair. It's saying that despair is not going to have the last word, and I'm going to be an agent of hope. And hope is not just some sit back and let's pray things change. Hope gets up in the morning, rolls up its sleeves, and goes to work. And the hope has got to be changing the culture of our planet. And in this country, if we want to lead on this issue, why aren't we leading in discovering new ways to wrap our products that don't involve petrochemicals and that are biodegradable? Why aren't we changing the habits in our cities and our towns of plastic bag use and all of this? This is a crisis of global proportions, and we're acting as if the little teeny bit that we're doing is somehow going to stop our grandchildren from experiencing a world where there is more plastic, I hope to be alive in 2050, more plastic in our oceans than all of the fish and marine wildlife. That is where we're heading. In fact, we could be getting there quicker with the onslaught of globalization and how many packages I order from Amazon Prime, and I can go on and on and on about that. And so that's my thinking, is that this is a great early steps in this crisis, but we've got to start doing a lot more aggressive things if we're going to actually avert a disaster that we see coming towards us. That every scientist, every report from the World Economic Forum to the Journal of Science Advance, everything I could get my hands on says we are heading, screaming towards a level of peril that our efforts right now don't seem to fully grasp. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I want to thank Senator Booker for his leadership on this issue and obvious passion, and I think it's what we need, and it's much appreciated. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the chairman and the ranking member, as well as the senator from New Jersey, for their leadership on this issue. This is a bipartisan issue. It's important to me for obvious reasons. Ms. Wallace, I wanted to ask you about the garbage patch in the Pacific. Let's just do it this way to start. Describe it for us.
Yes, the garbage patch has gotten this amazing sort of reputation that maybe it doesn't deserve. I think people think about an island of solid trash out in the middle of the ocean, twice the size of Texas. That's what we hear, right? But what it actually is, it's the North Pacific Gyre. It's a convergent zone where things that don't have propulsion on their own will end up. So it's a collection area. But it's not a solid land mass. It's bundles of fishing gear. It's tiny pieces of microplastic that can be spread miles apart and throughout the water column or on the benthic surface. So you can actually sail through the garbage patch without necessarily knowing you're in it.
It's just covered in trash.
Well, it is, but it's not, you may not see all the trash, right? So it's not this big solid land mass. It's actually kind of all spread apart. We've used the analogy of a peppery soup, if you think about it. So these little pieces that are flowing throughout.
Okay, thank you. And then when it comes to marine debris, marine trash, what is the composition of marine trash on the planet, if we know this, between sort of maritime uses, between dumping, between sort of landfill practices that are not best practices? In other words, where is this all coming from?
It's a great question, and it is something that we don't necessarily have the exact answer, but I can certainly tell you there is a mix of land-based and sea-based sources. For instance, in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, we know that we accumulate 50 tons of derelict fishing gear a year in this pristine environment. But if you look at the Ocean Conservancy's International Coastal Cleanup data, the past 30 years of picking up trash on the beach, the number one item is almost always cigarette butts, followed by plastic bottles, plastic bags, consumer debris. So we know that a huge amount is these land-based sources of debris. And NOAA has a monitoring program to try to get at that more.
So we don't know.
Well, I think there's a number that we hear a lot, sort of 80% land and 20% sea, but I think it really depends on where specifically you're looking. To get a real global estimate, it's hard, but we know it's all bad.
And sure, but from the land-based trash, are these landfills that are along the coastline and trash that ends up in the ocean, or is this the dumping of land-based trash into the ocean?
In the United States, I would say a lot of it's coming from sort of mismanaged waste, things that flow off garbage trucks, maybe don't get put into garbage cans, littering. But it can come all the way down through the rivers. So it doesn't necessarily have to be your beach debris. And here in Washington, D.C., we know things are coming straight down the Anacostia River into the Potomac and out into the Chesapeake Bay. So it doesn't necessarily come just from our people that are right on the shores. It's coming from all over.
So the reason I'm asking this is not just to satisfy my curiosity, but obviously we want to know where it comes from so we can figure out how to go upstream and stop it.
Right.
And, you know, Senator Booker talked eloquently about the need for behavior to change and the need for some of our societal norms to change. And the good thing is that we're innovative enough to still have a convenient life and reduce the amount of waste we put into landfills and then accidentally put into the ocean. But the question that I have, and I'm troubled because I have some pretty good experts on my own staff and they have access to other experts, that we don't really know from whence all this comes. And how to go upstream and determine, especially in the international context, what do we do about the poor management of landfills, for instance, in Southeast Asia? You know, we just don't know what percentage of the problem this comprises.
Right. So I think, you know, in the United States, one of the things we're doing is we have robust monitoring programs. So I mean, it's a small thing, but we can start to see what the biggest items are in specific areas. Our partners in Virginia find tons and tons of balloons on their beaches. And if we didn't have that monitoring data, we wouldn't know. But knowing that they're balloons, maybe we can do a really big push on education saying, hey, don't release your balloons into the air. In Washington, we found a lot of aquaculture debris. So we can go to the aquaculture industry and say, this is a problem, we have the data. In developing countries, I think it's a very different story. I think we need to really think about the financing and the value around waste and how we incentivize that value and that collection. So there are different solutions depending on the different places that you are.
Mr. Bolton, do you have anything to add?
No, she said it perfectly.
Thank you.
Mr. President, can I just submit for the record? Because I think what I would really like for you and I and others to consider is what these two experts, what are some of the things that are not being done or not being suggested by the legislation we put forth that they would prioritize significantly for Congress to be looking at doing. I think an action plan that might be more ambitious for us to consider would be really helpful if we can submit that for the record.
Well, yeah, why don't we do that in terms of our witnesses, all three witnesses today, and if Senator Whitehouse has the opportunity to make it, he's going to be another witness. But I think that's a good idea. We have legislation that I believe is supported by the administration. We're certainly encouraging you to take additional steps, but if you can provide us suggestions for what's not in the legislation, but you still think we need to prioritize, I think that would be a very helpful exercise, and you know, we'd like to give you as much time as you need to come back to us, because we'd like you to get that right, and we'd like to get some kind of consensus on it. I think it's an excellent suggestion. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Ms. Wallace for, you know, this in another iteration, obviously, the tsunami debris, which you helped Alaska, Washington, and Oregon deal with some of that debris, and we so appreciate it because here we were, this similar issue, but obviously a different cause, and left with the cost. I think in one instance, we had a major dock show up on the Oregon coast, which was, who was going to remove that? This wasn't like a weekend crew of people. And so the cost of all of this debris does affect our fishing community, our coastal community. So thank you for that. I wanted to bring up the issues of derelict vessels, and well, to either of you, really. I mean, the GAO recently completed a study on abandoned and derelict vessels, and you know, we had this Davy Crockett, which was a derelict barge in the Columbia River. It had spilled 1.6 million gallons of oil in the Columbia River, and it cost $21 million to clean it up. And so the GAO in their study found that there were significant gaps in who owned this issue. So I wanted to hear from both of you what, you know, the Coast Guard is responsible for moving the oil and hazardous substance, but not the vessel. The Army Corps, if it is deemed a navigational hazard. So you could have a derelict vessel that wouldn't be deemed a navigational hazard, and there it would be sitting there for a long time. And so what is NOAA's role, Dr. Wallace, and what do you think we should be doing to create more certainty and predictability for our communities about removing derelict vessels?
Abandoned and derelict vessels are a real problem, and I think a lot of people may not think of them as marine debris, but they are. For NOAA, we have the ability to provide funding, and we do so through competitive grants to remove vessels, but it certainly is not enough funding or comprehensive enough to remove every derelict vessel. So one of the things that we've been able to do is work with different states who have different programs. Washington in particular has a very good program about collecting fees that can then be used to remove those vessels when they become derelict. And so we've been working with states to help share that information. In Florida, they have a great program, a vessel at risk program, where there's a lot of enforcement around identifying which vessels may become derelict and using preventative measures through enforcement opportunities to help maybe make them not become derelict. But I think it is a gap, and I think that GAO report showed that very clearly. If there isn't a responsible party, and if there isn't a navigational hazard or oil and gas situation, it does become sort of the problem of the local landowner, which is not right, and that's where we are right now.
Do you have a recommendation?
Well, I think there's more things we can do to help prevent them. That's the best thing we can do. If there's vessel turn-in programs, in some states, that's an opportunity. So if you, it costs a lot of money to dispose of a boat appropriately. So if there's kind of these opportunities, certain weekends when people can go and dispose of their boats free of charge, I think that would be great. And also these vessel at risk programs, expanding them, and then looking for areas where we might be able to have funding through local programs that then would help address when a vessel does become derelict.
Mr. Bolton, any comments here about derelict vessels?
Only this. I'm glad you raised that because we have been focusing almost exclusively until this point in the hearing on plastic pollution, which is, of course, a serious problem. But as you point out, there are other serious categories of marine pollution. You mentioned one, I mentioned a couple of others. We have nutrient pollution. Excess nutrients flow off of, for example, agricultural areas, out rivers, and they create dead zones in the ocean. There's some 600 of those around the world. We have oil pollution problems still around the world. So in looking at marine debris, it's important not to lose sight that there are many different types of pollution, and they are amenable of different types of solutions, unfortunately, but they're all important.
Well, I thank my two colleagues for having this hearing, and I thank the witnesses, and I hope we do spend time on this aspect of it. We had another incident where up in our shellfish industry in the North Sound, we had another derelict vessel, and it shut down the industry up there. So these can be more than just an eyesore. They can be a real threat to the environment and activity, and I just think this gap between Coast Guard and Army Corps and NOAA is still something we should think about. I'm all for partnership. I like the idea that you're saying that you might be able to prevent some of these. We'll look into what states are doing that and what else we can do. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Senator Peters had a follow-up question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment, and I wanted to mention this to Ms. Wallace because you talked about fishing gear that gets cut loose or lost or whatever it may be floating around the ocean. That I actually had an opportunity to at least see a video of some courageous folks from NOAA out in Monterey Bay, California. I was out there recently, and about a week before I was there, I know that they were dealing with a humpback whale who had swam through an abandoned net that was wrapped all around the whale. The whale was struggling, was not going to survive. And folks from NOAA actually went out there in a small boat, went out there and hooked up to the whale. It was like a Nantucket sleigh ride from the old days, and cut the net off of the whale and set the whale free that was going to live, and then was able to recover that net. But I think the American public needs to know that NOAA is truly a hands-on agency that goes out there and is saving marine mammals as well as other work. So I wanted to thank you and all of your colleagues at NOAA for what you do every day.
Director Wallace, I had a follow-up that I wanted to ask you about, and I know that you've done a lot of work on this issue. It's a particularly challenging issue, but it deals with remote areas in our country in terms of marine debris cleanup. And I agree with kind of the theme of the panel and the witnesses and some of the senator's questions. I mean, I think we clearly need to get to prevention as the key, but cleanup is also important. And there are areas, as you know, in Alaska that are extremely difficult to collect marine debris from, that have literally tons of debris on some of our shores. The Gulf of Alaska Keeper is an Alaska nonprofit that NOAA's worked with, collected and transported over 1 million pounds of marine debris from remote Alaska beaches in 2015 alone, using helicopters, barges, other ships, with only a small crew of dedicated volunteers. So what additional resources does your program require, or not just resources, but ideas on trying to get to some of these remote cleanup areas? Obviously in Alaska it's the most extreme cases, but I'm sure it exists in Michigan and other parts of the country, that this is a challenge for all of us.
Remote areas are an incredible challenge. That specific effort that the Gulf of Alaska Keeper led in 2015 was logistically amazing. You know, the fact that they were able to helicopter debris off these remote beaches, get them onto a barge, and then have that barge go down to Seattle was really, I think, showcased exactly some of those challenges. We're also working with Sitka Sound Science Center in some very remote Bering Sea communities to remove debris that is most likely not being generated by those communities. It's washing from ashore, from offshore. And so I think it really does become just leaning on those partners that have that technical expertise and providing the funding that they need. So a lot of those partners have received funding through our competitive grants. And a lot of times the areas that are more remote, it costs more and they get the higher grants, you know, and that's part of it. But you're absolutely right. Removal has immediate ecosystem benefits, economic benefits. So something we're going to keep doing.
And just one final question related to that. How do we, you know, NOAA's doing a great job and we're all complimenting you. Our bill looks to reinforce and expand your efforts. But how do we empower these organizations that are on the ground, that are literally the front lines, like Gulf of Alaska Keeper and many, many others? Senator Peters mentioned even some of the classroom activities. How do we work to further partner but empower them to be able to effectively do this in a more creative way?
Well, I think one of the things that we've been very proud of is a lot of our partners get funding from us to get a project started, and then they actually make that project sustainable by finding funding elsewhere, or thinking about innovative solutions. So one of the things we're doing right now, it's kind of a new interesting idea, is in Dutch Harbor, looking at collecting fishing nets that have been accumulating there forever, but looking at public-private partnerships. So working with Matson and Trident to actually collect the gear, truck it down to Seattle, and then actually sending it to Denmark to be recycled. And I think that's one of the things we have to keep thinking about, is how do we get creative with the resources we have and the partners that are interested and have resources to give.
Great. Well, again, we'll continue to work on that. I appreciate your efforts in that regard, and I think we have a couple other senators who are interested in asking the panel some additional questions. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask a question about cruise ships. We all know that cruise ships are a potential source of debris and waste. Let me ask you, when cruise ships sail along the coasts of the United States and out to sea, do you think that the current laws are sufficient to protect against the kinds of pollution they can cause, the current treaties and rules?
Well, cruise ships and all ships are subject to MARPOL Annex 5, so they are not allowed to dump waste, and specifically plastic waste or household waste, paper waste in all areas. And so the laws are there. I think the question becomes an enforcement issue, and that would be a question for our colleagues at the Coast Guard. But the laws are in place, and we are subject to those laws.
Well, on enforcement, can you make some suggestions for how either rules can be made more enforceable or what can be done to assure greater enforcement?
Well, I think, again, I probably would want to defer to my colleagues at the Coast Guard, since they are the lead for enforcement. I think in any case, certainly education about the laws that do exist, and really requiring our partners in all industries to be able to follow those are very important. But I think that may be a Coast Guard question to follow up on the specific enforcement that they do with cruise ships.
Mr. Bolton?
I'm not an expert on the regulation of cruise ships, but I can tell you this, that the cruise line industry has proven itself willing in the past to work with our government to use the cruises themselves as ways to educate the people on it about the marine environment, including about marine pollution issues, including from those ships themselves. So one other idea that might be worth pursuing is partnerships with CLIO and other cruise line industry associations to actually advance awareness of marine pollution problems.
Are there specific efforts at education that you think should be undertaken?
So another place where people have a vested interest in keeping the marine environment pristine are the coastal resort communities and the big hotels. And once again, you can enlist these partners to try to educate their consumers, the people who come to these places, on the importance of limiting trash.
When you talk about education, do you mean education of passengers on the cruise ships or education of the managers and owners of the cruise ships?
I would say both.
But maybe you can tell me how passengers on a cruise ship, I realize they may toss stuff overboard, but the major source of contamination is from the waste emanating from the cruise ships, correct?
Yes.
So really, when you talk about education, isn't the best means of education deterrence? In other words, enforcement?
Yes, sir, that makes sense.
And so that brings us back to enforcement. Do you have any opinions on enforcement? Is there sufficient enforcement?
Again, you should probably ask that question to somebody who's involved in enforcement of those laws, and that would principally be Coast Guard, also some colleagues in the Department of Justice involved in environmental enforcement issues of this kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Chairman, President Kennedy was right when he once said of the shores of the Atlantic Ocean that all of us have in our veins the exact same percentage of salt in our blood that exists in the ocean, and therefore we have salt in our blood, in our sweat, and in our tears. We are tied to the ocean, and when we go back to the sea, whether it is to sail or to watch it, we are going back from whence we came. The Atlantic Ocean, Mr. Chairman, is a natural wonder. President Kennedy is correct, and it is also an economic engine supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs in key industries such as fishing and tourism. Fishing off of the East Coast states produces roughly $1.75 billion in direct value for those states and more than $4 billion in total economic activity each year. Tourism on the East Coast draws visitors to our beaches and our coastlines. It generates hundreds of billions of dollars in additional economic activity and supports an estimated 800,000 jobs. Marine debris, which can range from larger items like plastic bags, water bottles, or other pieces of trash to microscopic plastic particles, is a threat to this vital oceanic wonder and also to the industries in New England and other East Coast states that have sustained families in their employment for generations. During the International Coastal Cleanup Days in the fall of 2016, 2,500 volunteers in Massachusetts collected over 13,000 pounds of marine debris on 164 miles of Massachusetts beaches and waterways. But this is a tiny amount compared to the estimated 8 million metric tons of plastic that makes its way into the ocean each year. Ms. Wallace, how can this massive amount of marine debris harm not only our marine life and environment, but also industries like the fishing industry of Massachusetts?
Marine debris can have a big economic impact both on from a tourism standpoint, but also from a fishing standpoint. So one of the things that NOAA did a few years ago was do a comprehensive study at looking at the economic impacts of derelict crab pots in Chesapeake Bay. We found that if you remove targeted areas where there's a lot of traps that accumulate all at once, you can actually have an impact of 38 million pounds of crab harvest, which equates to $33 million. That's annually. We have done similar work in Massachusetts with the lobster fishery. So we've worked with the Department of Marine Fisheries to look at how many lobster are actually caught in lost fishing gear, and it's substantial. So I think looking at how we can look to prevent derelict fishing gear from being lost, but a lot of times you really can't prevent it. So if we know where there's areas that we can actually remove to have that biggest impact is what we want to do, because these are really big numbers.
Thank you. Yeah, so what are the impacts of marine debris on fish stocks? Does it impact their ability to reproduce? Does it make them more susceptible to disease or other environmental stress? How else does it harm that fishing stock?
Well, fishing gear is extremely efficient at catching fish or crabs or lobster. And when it's lost, it will continue to do so for years. We found even in Massachusetts where lobster pots can continue to fish for decades. And so what we want to be able to do is minimize that, because that's a huge, huge natural resource impact and also an economic impact to the fishermen.
So the New England Aquarium has been participating in a campaign called In Our Hands, which is encouraging the public to choose alternatives over single-use plastic. Would more organically based plastics help reduce marine debris, and how can we take this model to encourage using less single-use plastic on a larger scale?
I think materials that are made of natural items obviously will degrade quickly in an environment. And so that's something we should look at. Biodegradable plastics can be a little bit of a misnomer because they may not fully ever degrade in ocean conditions, and we don't want to give people the license to be able to toss that product if they think it's biodegradable into the ocean. So I think we have to be careful about looking for alternative materials is certainly something that will be important to solving the problem.
Okay, great. And as the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Near Eastern and South and Central Asian Affairs, I'm curious, Mr. Bolton, on your work in East Asia. Yeah. Your testimony discusses the State Department's efforts to work with rapidly developing Asian economies to reduce marine debris, especially microplastics. International cooperation, especially with developing economies in Asia, is essential to reducing the amount of waste in our ocean. How does marine debris from Asia impact our environment and industries here in the United States?
Mostly because the trash that is dumped in the ocean there or makes its way into the ocean there arrives on our shores in Hawaii, Alaska, the West Coast. But we have found some venues in which to engage with the Asian producers of marine debris. I was talking earlier in the hearing about our efforts to use the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum to strengthen waste management capabilities in these Asian states. We're trying to support Indonesia, which has articulated a goal of reducing its marine pollution by 70% by 2025.
Can I just ask you on that issue of Indonesia's goal of reducing it by 70% by 2025, what is the role the State Department is playing, our government playing, in helping the Indonesian government to accomplish that goal?
We're trying to connect people in Indonesia with the experts in the United States who know about this. For example, we sponsored Dr. Jambak from the University of Georgia, one of our leading experts, to go to Indonesia to work with the officials there and to raise awareness of this problem. So we see ourselves as a facilitator of these types of activities.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you so much for holding this very important hearing. I just think it spotlights something that is critical for us to deal with on a bipartisan basis. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Markey, and appreciate your strong support on this. I also just want to mention, Ambassador Bolton, you talked about partnerships. I think we've been talking about how this bill has broad-based bipartisan support. It also has strong support across different sectors of advocacy groups, environmental groups, industry groups. And in that regard, I'd like to submit for the record the statement for the record by the American Council, the American Chemistry Council, and I'm going to submit that for the record without objection. The first panel is excused. I thought that was an excellent discussion of this important issue. We want to thank you for your work on this, and we look forward to continuing to work with you on this important issue. And I would like to call up Dr. Melissa Duhain, the Assistant Professor from the University of Michigan, to lead our second panel. And Dr. Duhain, welcome. Thank you for listening to that first panel, and we look forward to hearing your testimony. And I believe that we will also have Senator Whitehouse will be joining you testifying here in a few minutes, but we'd like you to begin. So please, welcome. Thank you.
Good morning. I thank Chairman Sullivan and my Michigan Senator, Ranking Member Peters, and the subcommittee members for inviting me to today's hearing. As a representative of the research community, I appreciate being at this table and part of these discussions. My name is Melissa Duhain, and I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. I studied at Cornell University, and I hold a doctorate from the Max Planck Institute for Marine Microbiology. I've worked in ocean and freshwater sciences for over a decade, and I've sampled or studied plastics around the globe, but most extensively in the Great Lakes over the last 5 years. In that time, we've learned that plastic pollutants are widely present in the Great Lakes and impact food supplies of aquatic animals, but with unknown consequences to human health. A study out last week reported that almost 80% of plastic ever produced still remains in landfills or dispersed in the environment today. I've heard a lot of analogies today, so I'll add one more to that. That represents 10 times the biomass of humans on this planet. So for every one of us in here, there are 10 more of us out there in plastic. Each year, 8 million tons of plastic find its way into our oceans. These numbers will continue to rise as the global production of plastic continues to increase exponentially, as we've heard a lot about today. And these trends are no different in freshwater. While most research has focused on the distribution and impacts of marine litter, most plastic pollution originates on land. Freshwater bodies serve as conduits for the transport of this plastic to the oceans. And humans live in closer contact with freshwater. 90% of the world's populations live only 6 miles from a freshwater body. As the largest freshwater system on the planet, the Great Lakes holds 1/5 of the world's surface freshwater, and these are arguably one of the most valuable national security assets. In 2014, my lab led the largest survey to date of Great Lakes plastic pollution. We collected and counted surface plastic as small as 1/10 of a millimeter from over 100 samples. We found plastic at every site. The sample with the highest concentration of plastic from the Detroit River contained almost 2 million plastics per square kilometer. That's 4 times higher than yet reported in the surface of the Great Lakes and among the highest ever reported in nature. The highest concentrations of plastics were found near Great Lakes cities, in river plumes, directly at the output of wastewater treatment plants and following storm events. As with all plastic pollution, the smallest plastics dominated our samples. Given this trend, new analytical techniques are needed to quantify with higher confidence and higher throughput these micro and especially nano-sized plastics, of which we know near nothing about, but whose health risks would be the highest. Nanoplastics have the potential to pass cell membranes, delivering toxins and directly interfering with metabolic pathways. In ongoing laboratory studies at the University of Michigan, Lake Michigan quagga mussels and chironomid worms consume nano-sized plastic, mistaking them for food. These organisms, the mussels and these worms, are central to the Great Lakes food web. The worms are a food source for all foraging fish, which are then consumed by the greater fish-eating fishes, such as salmon, trout, bass, and walleye, and later by humans. In the water, these plastics serve as sponges of persistent organic pollutants. 2 of these toxins, which are known carcinogens that can also interfere with reproduction, PAHs and PCBs, were detected on plastic from Lake St. Clair, the Detroit River, and near the Cleveland wastewater treatment plant output. Also, antibiotics, herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides have been detected on plastic in Lake Erie. The implications of these findings, particularly for the living creatures that eat the plastics, have not yet been explored. So in summary, the basic research has shown that plastic is everywhere. It's in all oceans on the planet, in the Great Lakes, in remote alpine lakes, in beer and fish sold for human consumption, and it's near certain that humans are consuming plastic. In the wake of these discoveries, the UN has declared plastic pollution among the most critical emerging environmental issues of our time. And the scientific consensus is that plastic pollution must be reduced to avoid risk of irreversible ecosystem harm. As of today, the direct human health consequences of plastic are unknown. Continued basic research really is central to our ability to define these environmental risks and the economic and public health impacts of plastic pollution. I look forward to sharing future findings with you all and continuing to be a resource to the committee. I thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Great. Well, thank you for that testimony, and we are now joined by a very distinguished witness to join us, Senator Whitehouse, who has been a leader on this issue, and I am very, very pleased that he has joined us today to testify on an issue that he's not only led on in the Senate, but is very passionate about. Senator Whitehouse.
Intermittently distinguished, Chairman Sullivan, intermittently, but thank you. To you and to Senator Peters, I really appreciate this opportunity.
We've had many, just so you know, we've probably had about 8 or 9 senators at this hearing already, so it's a lot of interest.
Good. Well, there should be, because this is a very important issue. One of the things that we are learning, as you know, is that billions of tons of plastic is going into the oceans. We did a hearing together in the Environment and Public Works Committee in which the testimony was that a great deal of that was going into the Pacific, and your Aleutian Islands reach up like an arm across the top of the Pacific and catch an enormous amount of that waste along your shores. I believe that the comparison was that in Rhode Island we do annual beach cleanups with garbage bags, and you have to do it with front-end loaders and containers and at a whole level of scale with tons per linear mile of oceanfront in some places. So it's really serious, and what we have learned through the good work of Ocean Conservancy and a scientist, I believe, at the University of Georgia named Jenna Jameson, is that the biggest contributor to that problem is a handful of Asian nations that have horrible upland waste management. And because plastic lasts so long, if you have terrible upland waste management, sooner or later things work their way to the sea, and then off you go to the races, and then you end up with these billions and billions. So one of the things that we're recommending in the legislation that you have led on is that our trade representatives start to pay attention to this fact. If it's hitting home in Alaska, if it's hitting home around the world, we should not be paying zero attention, which is the record so far, to this problem of treating a trading partner of ours as if it's totally okay to have zero upland waste disposal. Gives them competitive advantage because they don't have to pay for waste disposal, and we pick up half of their tab through the trash that we then have to clean up. The second piece of this that I'll mention in my remarks today is that the stuff goes out there, and we're headed for a world in which there's actually more plastic waste mass in the ocean than there is living fish mass in the ocean. That's not a great place. But the plastic doesn't biodegrade in the ocean. It breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces to the point where those little pieces can be taken up by little phytoplankton, little creatures in the food chain, whoever's eating down there gets these little things in them, and then they start working their way back up the food chain. And we have no idea what effect that has on human consumption of fish and on people who have fish, like many Alaskans do, as a big part of their diet. So we need to study that, and we need to put to work our national labs and our universities to try to figure out how to make a plastic that when you leave it in the ocean, it actually biodegrades back to core elements and reintegrates into the natural world instead of just making smaller and smaller and smaller plastic pieces. This is a great issue for us to work together on in bipartisan fashion. It was your leadership that caused the hearing to be held in the Environment and Public Works Committee. It's your leadership that has caused this hearing to be held today. I stand with you, ready to help in any way. I hope that if we can get through our current standoff on health care and go back to more regular order, that our bill becomes something that can move rapidly through the hotline, and there's an equivalent bill in the House, so there's a real opportunity here for bipartisan progress. But it would not be possible without your leadership, and Senator Peters is also an original co-sponsor as well as a co-leader of our Oceans Caucus, which has been very successful in moving this forward. So with all of that, let me express my appreciation to you both. Let me express my appreciation to the committee for allowing me to come and testify and show my support and ring out with the message that this is important. This is something that our children and grandchildren will be looking at us to say, why did you or didn't you do something about this? And that this is a real bipartisan opportunity. So,
well, thank you very much. And I think you're being a little humble here because I appreciate the comments about the leadership, but just for the record, the driving force on this, where I've learned a lot about this issue, not just from my constituents, but from Senator Whitehouse. So it is true bipartisan effort and consideration with Senator Peters. Senator Booker, who was here earlier, gave a very impassioned testimony and pleas. So I think,
and of course, your senior senator, Senator Murkowski, was the original co-founder of the Oceans Caucus and has been a part of this all along as well. So big Alaska footprint on this, but primarily yours, and I appreciate it. The gavels matter, and you've used yours to great effect.
Well, and one thing that we mentioned earlier, this is passed out of committee on the Commerce Committee already, bipartisan, and I believe we are beginning the hotline process, and so hopefully we can move that soon. But thank you again for your testimony. And Professor Duhain, we have a couple follow-up questions. Thank you for your patience. Let me just go to kind of two issues that Senator Whitehouse talked about that's really been a theme here. But you're really kind of very well positioned, given your background and your research, to help us understand these issues better. Bottom line is we really don't know what the impact and health effects are right now with regard to the microplastics, to the health of fish, or even the impact for humans, correct?
Sorry. That is true. One of the notes that I wrote down earlier that I heard repeatedly was the quote, "We don't know."
Yeah. Well, again, we appreciate your professional work and your research and want to encourage you to do that, so we do know, do have a better. But let me get to another question that he raised that I think is also, we can view as an opportunity and a challenge. As I mentioned, and I just submitted for the record the statement by the American Chemical Council, Senator Peters and I were talking about this before the hearing. Are we getting close, in your view, from the perspective of research and what's going on in industry or academia with regard to having, at least for example, salt water, a true biodegradable plastic? It would seem to me that would be very, very good for the environment in our oceans, and it would also be an opportunity for entrepreneurs who could ever figure out a way to do that to benefit it as well, a win-win. But do you believe that we're getting there? Because that could be very helpful. We're not there yet.
Unfortunately, I do have to admit I'm not a chemist and an expert in the realm of material sciences, so I think you'd be better suited to direct that question at someone with that expertise.
Okay, because I do think we're seeing that. We're seeing that in terms of even styrofoam and other areas that we could have the potential for a full biodegradable product that could help, again, and that's another area that we're going to be focused on in the Congress. Let me ask you a final question. You know, there's been talk about the Great Lakes, there's been talk about the oceans. Does marine debris that reaches freshwater pose a different threat, different challenge, different way that we should think about it from a policy perspective than marine debris found in our oceans? Or is it pretty much broadly viewed as the same direct challenge?
Yeah, so I think there are a few differences in how the plastic behaves in the environment, influenced by the fresh water, which will influence its distribution in the water column. But I think more from a policy and human impact perspective, one thing that we do need to think about differently is that freshwater is drinking water sources. So having a closer look at the impact on fresh water as a drinking water source and serving as a mechanism to deliver plastics to our bodies.
And are there any immediate steps our state or federal agencies could take, in addition to what's in this bill, which is focused in a lot of ways on the oceans, to combat marine debris in the Great Lakes region?
I think a lot of the efforts and initiatives are quite transferable to the Great Lakes. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So I don't know any other specific recommendations that would be targeted at the Great Lakes.
Great. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Duhain, for being here, and thank you for all the work that you're doing on the Great Lakes. So we spent a lot of time during this hearing discussing the oceans, which are vitally important to the planet's health. But as the senator from Michigan, very concerned about the health of our state as well as the other states around the Great Lakes Basin. You mentioned in response to a question from Chairman Sullivan in regards to human health issues or differences perhaps in freshwater versus oceans, and you brought up the issue of drinking water. And I think it's very important, and one that I remind my colleagues about frequently here is that the Great Lakes provide drinking water to over 40 million Americans, a pretty significant source of water. And when I hear about your study, and I'd like you to elaborate on your study of the amount of plastic that you're finding in the Great Lakes, particularly microfibers. I mean, this is obviously being ingested by human beings, 40 million who are drinking out of the Great Lakes. You know, to what extent do treatment plants deal with this pollution when we're drinking that water? Are we effective in doing that? Is that a major concern that we have to consider?
So I personally don't have experience monitoring or evaluating drinking water treatment. I have been into multiple wastewater treatment plants to monitor the processing through those types of treatment plants and then what is output to the natural system. But I think one thing that does need to be done is looking at the source of drinking water and seeing what does pass through and how treatment systems are treating them.
So at least from your background, there has not been a lot of research into that area at this point? So this,
not at drinking water.
So this is, we know that microfibers and other types of plastics are very extensive in the Great Lakes. In fact, if I recall from the testimony you just gave, that you saw some of the highest levels ever. Would you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, that is true. I also believe that is a difference that you will see emerging when we start comparing counts and concentrations from marine systems to the Great Lakes. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, there is something to the dilution effect. And when you consider the concentration of humans living around coastlines of, for instance, the Great Lakes and the amount of water that's there, it is much more concentrated, and so that gives rise to the opportunity for greater incidence of encounter with humans, with organisms living in the water. So that factor.
What was the figure you gave for the Detroit River? What did you?
So that was 2 million particles per square kilometer. It was the value there that we counted.
And how did you compare that to the normal?
You
said that was the highest concentration you've ever
seen?
seen?
So prior in the Great Lakes, it was 500,000 was the greatest value before our study was performed, and that was in the eastern basin of Lake Erie. So generally less close to the coast, and I think that could have been influencing our high concentrations in the Detroit River.
So that's why you think there's a difference in the findings from previous findings of researchers in the Great Lakes?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why our study was enlightening was the greater number of studies. So for more robust, statistically robust counts, you need more sample points and greater samples. That actually gets to another bottleneck in this type of research, and the quality of the data, the reliability of the data that comes out of it is that I think one of the problems right now is the the best I can refer to it is that we're using caveman approaches to plastic quantification, that we really need improved analytical approaches to bring the data collection where it should be in the 21st century, so really harnessing the applied chemistry and physics that we know is out there. Right now, what we do is we go out, we pick up plastic and we count it, and that's usually with a plastic nylon mesh net, which you mentioned previously that fibers are an emerging issue, which is very much the case, and we see them enmeshed in the tissues of organisms in the Great Lakes or in the digestive tract. But how can we reliably count fibers with a nylon mesh net? And so there are certainly advancements in our ability to collect that raw data, those count data that could be improved. But why are we simply picking things up and counting them with our eyes? It's because these are the only techniques that are available to us. They're inexpensive, but we can and should, with funds provided, improve the analytical capacity to collect data.
In a response to the question from Chairman Sullivan about the differences between freshwater, the Great Lakes, and the oceans, you mentioned, of course, drinking water, which you elaborated on with my question. But you also mentioned that the distributions are different. Would you please elaborate on that?
Distributions of different plastics.
Correct. That it's different in the Great Lakes, and the movement is different than what you may find in the oceans, and why should that be a concern to us?
Yeah, so those differences stem from really the physical properties of water and salt versus fresh water. So the lower salinity means that the plastic that would normally float in the surface of the ocean will find a different place to settle or find its neutral position in the water column. So things that float in the oceans could presumably sink in fresh water. And our models have confirmed that floating plastic leaves the lakes faster than non-floating plastic. And so that in a closed or more relatively closed system like the Great Lakes could lead to a higher concentration and higher residence time of plastics in the lakes.
Well, given your extensive study, just one final question, Mr. Chairman, is what do you believe are the next research steps that we need to take to improve our understanding of Great Lakes and the debris problem that's there?
So as has come up several times in this second panel, I'd say that studies of organismal impacts of ingestion and inhalation, including humans, is of utmost priority. Also, updating the standards for measuring risk are, I think, an important element that should deserve some discussion, that are more appropriate for the properties of plastic. So in our kind of regimented, there are mechanisms to evaluate risk, environmental risk, put forth by agencies such as the EPA. Currently, they're not well suited to describe and define the risk incurred due to plastic. As I mentioned, improved analytical techniques are essential to bring our data collection to where it should be, as well as improved modeling of plastic transport. So in the absence of high throughput, highly accurate data collection, an alternative mechanism to give us information about where plastic is going, which habitats are most at risk, could be employing hydrodynamic models to predict where it will go and how quickly. As well as, this is outside of my expertise, but economic and health and societal impacts. So more the study of the societal impact of plastic pollution, its cleanup and its prevention, I think, are needed to help define incentives for change.
Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate your testimony today. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Professor Duhain, thank you again for your testimony, and we very much appreciate the work you're doing. We want you to encourage you to keep it up and continue to help us have a better understanding, but you've done a very good job of that today. So without any further questions, this hearing is now adjourned.